God gives the commandments of kosher, explaining how to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher animals, fish and birds. Animals are a category unto themselves. They require slaughter. They are the coarsest of all three of the categories. Birds are the next one in that they are somewhat less coarse. They only require a little bit, they require slaughter, but in a very kind of a simpler way. And then fish actually don't require slaughter at all. Taking them out of the water is considered their slaughter, and you don't actually need to do anything in particular as to how to process the fish in order to make it kosher. For that reason, these three categories exist in the first place. Kosher animals, meaning land animals, must chew their cud and have cloven feet. Fundamentally, all of these laws and requirements, as we said earlier, are statutory, just because God said so. There is no logical reason why a cow is kosher, but a pig is not. The concept or the idea that somehow kosher land animals are cleaner than non-kosher land animals is absolutely incorrect and stems from a simple mistranslation. The verse says, here and in Deuteronomy, do not employ the word unclean or dirty. They employ the word impure. And the mistranslation is really what causes the misconception. Purity and impurity is a question of something spiritual. Clean and unclean or dirty is a question of something physical. A human being, for example, can be incredibly dirty but pure. A person who just came out of the mikveh and is completely purified from any and all impurities during temple times, etc., all of a sudden has a bucket of garbage thrown on him. He's dirty, but he's pure. In the same token, exactly to the opposite. A person could be just out of a schwitz, a sauna, a hazmat, whatever, completely clean, disinfected, the whole 9 yards, but he's still impure. The one has nothing to do with the other. Therefore, fundamentally, all of the laws of kosher are just because God said so. That said, there are some insights that, as it were, God allowed for us to have through the different sages and commentaries over the years. And they explain that the characteristics of the animals that are not kosher are characteristics that we do not want to incorporate into us. And the characteristics of kosher animals are characteristics that we do want to incorporate into us. So the land animal being the coarsest of all three categories, we want to mitigate that coarseness with a little bit of humility. And we certainly do not want to expedite or kind of embolden that coarseness with more haughtiness. So the kosher land animal has to chew its own cud. The idea of chewing the cud is, in the analogy, rather than have a certain set of information or facts that I mull over and make a decision, as it were, swallowing that cud, and then done. I don't want to revisit it anymore. Right? I had a question as to what to do in a particular scenario. I did some thinking, I made a decision, and I'm not willing to revisit it. That is the non-kosher animal. It chews, swallows, done. A level of haughtiness. The level of chewing its own cud means chewing, swallowing, regurgitating, chewing again, swallowing, and maybe several more times. A scenario where I thought I knew what I was going to do, but now I'm deciding, because of a little bit of humility, to revisit the question and remull my decision. Cloven feet. When we have an animal that has non-cloven feet, let's say like a horse, it looks at itself and sees nothing beyond itself. That's a level of haughtiness. A cow, for example, that has cloven feet, looks at itself and sees beyond itself, recognizing that it's not the end-all of the universe. That is a little bit more humility. The Torah lists 4 animals that have only one of these attributes, but not both, and are therefore non-kosher. This additional blurb is seemingly unnecessary. Once the verse says that the 2 necessary characteristics of chewing the cud and having cloven feet is what makes an animal kosher, a land animal kosher, you don't need to say, oh, these particular ones are one but not the other, and they're also not kosher. I already know that they're not kosher. As soon as they're missing one, and obviously it doesn't matter how, if they're missing one of the two required characteristics, done. Two are required. I don't have two. It's not kosher. But nevertheless, the Torah does list 4 specific species that says that this is, one characteristic but not the other. Furthermore, the list of 4 is split into 2 subcategories. 3 of those 4 species, the hare, the hyrax, and the camel, do not have split hooves, but they do chew their own cud. And then the final one is the pig, which has split hooves, but doesn't chew its own cud. Again, I don't need to know all of this. The fact that they don't have both of the required characteristics is all that matters. They're not kosher. One of the kind of takeaways from this is that if a human being or a group of human beings had written the Torah rather than God having written the Torah, it wouldn't make practical or logistical sense for them to be so specific in particular so as to be found out later down the line, whether very quickly or not as quickly down the line, that in fact, look, there's an entire universe, entire world of zoology that we didn't know 3,000 years ago, and we found 10,000 other animals that have one characteristic and not the other. And nevertheless, they put it in. And lo and behold, 3,300 and whatever years later, there is not a single other animal of all of the newly discovered species that would violate what the Torah says here. In fact, to this day, there are only 4 species of animals that have one characteristic and not the other, and they actually divide into these 2 subcategories of the 3 having one and the one having the other. Kosher fish must have fins and scales. When we look in the Mishnah, however, the Mishnah tells us that, look, fins you don't really need to worry about. Scales is really what matters. Because if a fish has scales, it automatically has fins. Not vice versa. If a fish has fins, not necessarily does it have scales, but if it has scales, for sure it has fins. I go into my local fish shop in Kiwani. I cannot rely on the sign that says, tilapia or salmon or something else. Whether because the guy could lie if he wanted to, or because there are different subspecies generally known as, let's say, tuna. There are impure tuna. There are tuna that are not kosher, and then there are tuna that are kosher. So he might not even be lying, but it could be a misunderstanding that for me, obviously, is a big deal because I'm eating not something that's not kosher. The one thing I care about is seeing scales. Or even seeing the skin where he cleaned off the scales and you can still see the little divots. As soon as I see the scales or some remnant of the scales, I know that it's a kosher fish, even if I never see fins, because the scales guarantee that the fins are there or were there. That's as far as the practical halacha Jewish law goes. But as far as the deeper meaning for our service of God, fins are what allow the animal to travel through the water. Scales are what protect the animal from all of the different elements in the water. What guarantees progress, what guarantees fins, is if you have scales. If you have that which will protect you from the negative influences around you, you are guaranteed proper and kosher progress through the world, through life. Scales guarantee fins. The other way, it doesn't work. Fins do not guarantee scales. Just because you are making progress does not mean that you will eventually not succumb to some negative element from around you. You cannot rely on fins. You can only rely on scales, which will then guarantee fins for a proper kosher fish. The Torah then gives a list of species of non-kosher birds and species of kosher locusts. The Torah then discusses the ritual impurity caused by coming in contact with the carcass of a non-kosher animal, as well as certain species of rodents and amphibian creatures. The 7th Aliyah. We learn of the possibility of foods and utensils contracting ritual impurity if they come in contact with any of the aforementioned impurities. The Torah then mentions the impurity contracted through coming in contact with the carcass of a kosher animal, which was not ritually slaughtered. We are commanded not to consume any insects or reptiles. The commentaries say, nobody would want to really eat insects. It's not like a common thing that most people like. Even though there are some kitchens, where it's a delicacy, that's certainly the exception and not the rule, and for millennia has been that way. So what's the point of making that commandment? Other than the fact that it's wrong, but if a person's not going to want to do it anyway, we don't need to necessarily even state it. So here the sages say that God will give you the reward for not doing something, even if you're not doing it because it's just something you don't necessarily want to do. Is that the ultimate way in serving God? Certainly not. The ultimate way in serving God is to do it because He said so and you want to fulfill whatever He's commanding. But in fact, even if you're doing it only for the fact that it's just not what you want to do, but technically, of course, fulfills God's will, that also brings with it reward. The reading closes with an exhortation that we remain holy by abstaining from eating all forbidden foods. The famous explanation of why this is connected to holiness is because eating is so corporeal. Because eating is so physical and so corporeal, and at the same time we are eating the way that we are eating because God said so, then that is the ultimate combination of the spiritual and the physical, which again harkens back to the very beginning of our Torah portion with the tabernacle.